Hello there, are we all ready to go at the back? I was just looking at my tech team. Brilliant. Hi and welcome to today's In Practice session on sustainable and fair participatory practice. Before we get going, I'll just do a few little housekeeping bits. So my name's Sarah Briggs. I'm the Collections Development Officer at the Museums Association. My pronouns are she, her. For a description of me, I am a middle-aged woman with brown hair in a bob for people at home. The session today is, obviously there's people here in person, there's people online, so it will be being recorded and it will be shown online on the MA website later. Do feel free to tweet about the session using today's hashtag Museums2021. If you're tuning in through Swapcard, please feel free to use the chat function and we'll be using that for questions later as well. For people in person, please put your mobile and digital devices onto silent. If the alarm sounds, then make your way to the nearest fire exit and the venue staff here will give you instructions from there. And if you're going to ask a question in the room later, just put your hand up and we've got volunteers with a mic. And for everybody, when we do questions at the end, please keep them short and to the point. The session will cut off the stream bang on time, so we definitely can't overrun. So let's try and get as many questions in as we can. So the idea for today's session was really born out of our funding programmes and the incredibly privileged role I have at the Museums Association, working with museums all across the country who are trialling and establishing sector-leading approaches to collections management and engagement. Museums are increasingly taking a participatory approach to working with communities. And this is reflected in the projects that we fund through the Esme Fairbairn Collections Fund and recently the Digital Innovation and Engagement Fund. But in order for participatory practice to succeed, the balance of power needs to shift, creating equitable relationships where the museum isn't automatically taking the leading role. But how can this be the case? How can we really create these equitable relationships if some of the people in the room are being paid and some of the people aren't? So many of our projects have been exploring ways to overcome this barrier really and make sure that they can have much more equity in their relationships with participants. And the two of our projects are here today to talk about just this and to share how they've approached this issue and discuss some of the considerations that are needed to find the best solutions for participants to ensure equity. So my first speakers here today are Jenny Bull and Danika Parikh from the University of Cambridge Museums, and I'll hand over to them now. Thank you.
Why don't we check this one? I think it's, can you hear us? Yep, great. So we're going to talk about two very specific community projects where we've paid community participants today. But we thought it would just be really useful just to really quickly talk about the context of the University of Cambridge Museums, and we say UCM for short. So we're a national portfolio organisation, and there's a small team of us that work across 7 museums and a botanic garden owned by the University of Cambridge. And we also work very closely with Kettledge Yard Art Gallery, who are another local NPO, which is why they appear on this slide. So all the collections have their own central funding from the university and their own kind of governance structures and staff resources, and we work within them to bring colleagues from across all the sites to work together on various streams of work, one of which is audience engagement and learning and community relationships. So the community work that happens across the UCM kind of varies because of that. So the two projects that we're going to talk about, one is an example of community work where the participants were paid happening in one collection in the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and the other one is kind of led centrally by the UCM, so it's kind of connecting collections and more about the kind of the work of what we do together. So we just wanted to point out that while the project's an example that we're exploring kind of how we can collaborate with communities in a more equitable way and bring more voices into kind of different areas of work, we're very much at the beginning of our journey, I think.
Yep, so the first project that we wanted to talk to you about was something called the Represent Project, which, as Jen said, was based at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge. So this was something that I started actually about 2 years ago when I wasn't formally working full-time with the museums. So I sort of had this idea, someone who'd been in and out of the museums and was working part-time, but wasn't actually working in museums for the duration of the entire project. So a slightly interesting journey. So the point of the project was that I'd sort of become very frustrated by the limitations of traditional museum labeling, which I'm sure is something lots of people have felt. And I think particularly, what's often called the danger of a single story and the single narrative that a lot of these labels presented, particularly when you have, in a museum context, when you have really one curator who'll write, 50 labels or something, or more, something like that. And I really wanted to see how we could bring different voices into museums and new voices and actually tell new stories about the objects that were on display. So we had several aims, which helpfully summarized in advance behind me, which I can't read properly from down here, but trust me, I stand by them. Who and when? We worked with a local diaspora community group. Sorry?
Sorry, I was mumbling, or sit by them. Bad joke, so.
Either. I lie by that. No, not that one. So we worked with a local diaspora community group called the Cambridge African Network, and we did workshops with them actually all online, and 2 separate workshop sessions, one where we tried to talk more about museums generally, find out how they felt about museums in Cambridge and what their relationship with our museums and museums in general was. And then another one where they chose objects that were on display that they felt a personal, emotional connection to. That was sort of the only brief. It can be any object, as long as it's something that sparks some kind of response from you. And then to write a new label for those objects on display. And the participants were paid £80 total via a finance form through the museums. It actually took a long while to get the funding together for this project, so that's why I said it actually was about almost 2 years for quite a small scale project, because in the end I cobbled together 3 different grants to get the money to do that. And that's because I felt really strongly about the principle of paying people for this kind of work, and I think obviously the point is to value everyone's labor equally, to make sure that you're doing this work as a partnership, really, on an equal footing. And just to share one of the labels here that I really enjoyed, that one of our workshop participants, Chioma Obajaka, wrote. And she wrote this for one of the Ben and Bronzes that was on display. And I actually really loved it because she transformed how I saw this object, drawing on both her personal responses to it, but also drawing on culture-specific knowledge that she had. So she talked about how the bird of the figurine represented the ancestors for her, and about how the figure of the taller man sort of represented, authority figures, sort of leaders of the community, and the 2 smaller figures in front were children, and how this was really sort of the circle of life for her, between community and how together, everyone standing together, they were strong. So I wanted to share that because I found it really beautiful, and the labels went up on display in the museum, and the participants also recorded audio labels, which went online on a website that can be accessed. And I think that was also really wonderful, because I think recording things by audio, it made it really personal, actually, to hear it in people's voices, and in terms of accessibility, for disabilities, and also in the COVID landscape. I think it was really helpful to have lots of different ways that people could experience the words of the participants. So that's a sort of quick introduction to the first project, and now Jen is going to talk to you about our second project.
Yeah, so our second project is a pilot community panel for the UCM. It's the kind of first consultative community panel that we've had run by the UCM centrally, by myself and my colleague Nicola Hughes. It's been running since February 2021, and it will run until April 2022. So it's a 14-month pilot. And the aims are to test the process of running a panel like this and bringing in local voices to bear on more areas of our work that we do across the consortium. The sessions are like 2 hours long, and we normally meet about every 2 months or 1.5 months, and there's always a different UCM staff member that joins each session to talk about a different topic. The 12 panellists were already connected to the UCM, so prior to us convening the panel. So in 2019, we did a community mapping project, which helped us kind of get a snapshot of all the community partnerships held across all the collections. And from that, we recruited 12 individuals kind of who were already engaging with us to help us run the pilot. And so we approached them saying it was a pilot. And part of the pilot process was paying community members, because we felt very, very strongly that we wanted to test this out kind of before we took it into further parts of our practice. And also because it's a 14-month pilot where we're paying people regularly across that time, it's slightly different to kind of paying people for one-off sessions, kind of technically in terms of finance. So that was something we wanted to try as well. So the panel members are paid £40 per session, and again, we pay them by a finance form at the moment, which they get after every session. One of the things we had to go kind of overcome internally, because this is slightly different to Danika's project where we're using funding from the university, was we had to write terms of reference for the panel, which we were writing anyway, because that's what we were, that's a sort of a set of guidelines for the panel for expectations. And that really helped explain to our central finance colleagues kind of why we wanted to make these payments kind of regularly to community members. So yeah, so it's still ongoing at the moment, that project. So our reflections so far, the pilot process has been really helpful for me personally. I think for my colleague who's also running the panel with us, we had to start somewhere, and it enabled us to kind of test out how the community members felt interacting with all the kind of forms and things like that they get sent through the kind of bureaucracy of the finance of our university, but also our finance kind of colleagues kind of get used to it as well and find ways that we can kind of make these payments that still fit within the processes.
I have to say this microphone situation makes me feel like a footballer that's been accused of doing something terrible by the Daily Mail. Which is what being a museum worker is like in 2021. So like I said, I found it really helpful to group together several smaller grants. And I actually really want to say that if you're not formally based in a museum, lots of museums are really, really open to doing this kind of work. I actually had the idea and I took it to the museum and you know, we just ran with it from there. So if you're not based in a museum, actually just have some confidence in it and don't worry about the timelines of getting the funding together. Because like I said, I had to group together 3 separate grants and there were sort of months in between. So I'd get like a small pot of money and then sit on it for 6 months and then finally get a bit more. And then eventually we were actually able to do the project. So don't stress about the time so much, but kind of go with it. And it is really important to have the money. And I'm aware that lots of museums work with different financial resources, or like I said, if you're not based in a museum. So you can get a bit creative with how you collect that money.
Thank you. Yeah, and then the other kind of point was just all the paperwork can be quite extensive at first. And actually one of the members has come back to us because part of the pilot process is that we're asking them for evaluation, and they sort of said, oh, it's quite a lot of paperwork for £40, so maybe that's something that we need to think about for kind of future iterations, probably.
Yeah, agreed. That is feedback that we've had, which is that essentially the paperwork is a bit excessive. I think one of the things that we'd say is that it can feel excessive in your end as well, and then you feel bad because you're sort of extending that to your participants. But something that's really helpful to keep in mind is that when you're changing your policy, when you're changing internal process, it is huge at the start. That's a really, really big leap to make on several different fronts for lots of, maybe different departments or different members of staff at the same time. So even if you might think, okay, we've decided to start small, we've decided to try it sustainably, we're piloting the process, and this is still a huge, huge amount of work. Don't be discouraged by that because you're laying the way for actually bigger projects in the future as you go. So it is going to be a lot of paperwork at the start, but don't think this is so much paperwork for one session or something like that, because you learn from that and your organization will learn from that as well.
I'm going to skip to this one. So what's next? For the panel, we're going to keep the panel going until April 2022, and then do some kind of evaluation, and then hopefully build on these pilot projects and relationships to extend into other areas of our practice. One in particular, which Danika is now going to talk about.
Yes, so we've started a major project to investigate the legacies of empire and enslavement in our collections across the University of Cambridge museums. And as part of that, it's not just collections research, but we are also thinking more about how we engage with communities and how we can engage with communities better. So we want to keep building on these relationships. And we have funding from the Esme Fairbairn Foundation for a communities coordinator who's going to be leading on that work. And we're going to be thinking more about how specific collections can do it, because I think there's a need for nuance in this kind of work as well, to think about which communities are most relevant. Sometimes that's very local communities, and sometimes that can look very different as well. And I think that's actually one of the things about the pandemic, which is that this the distance can be crossed digitally a bit easier now as well. So I think that's something that's been helpful for us too. So yes, we're building on all of this work that we've been piloting, and I think if there was one thing I would say is that it's really okay to start small, and it's really, I mean, it's easy for us to sort of say neatly, this is what we did, and these are our takeaway points, but I think a lot of it you kind of do instinctively or instinctually at the start, and you make a lot of mistakes as you go as well. So kind of be forgiving with yourselves and with your participants as well, because when you're trying something new and big, it's very hard to get it right from the start, or even halfway through the process. So just sort of be prepared for that, I think, and just proceed as transparently as you can with people.
Yeah, I would echo that.
Yeah, I think we've maybe gone slightly over, but those are our projects. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much for that. We'll do questions at the end for all of our panellists, all of our speakers together, to make sure that we know that we're going to finish on time. So I'll introduce now, by the magic of the internet, our next speaker, Andrew Fowles, who is coming to us from Birmingham. He's part of Birmingham Museums Trust, and will be sharing his experience. Hi there, Andrew.
Can you hear me okay? Fantastic. That's good. I'm just going to share my screen for you. There we go. There we go. You should be all able to see that. So thanks for having me today. I'm going to talk today about the Guiders project. The Guiders project is one of our kind of community-driven projects that's based at Aston Hall. It's one of our museum sites, and really kind of follows the trend of looking deeper at the levels of co-production we have across our trust. So co-production's always been a way that we've sought to work with partners to find ways to create better ownership over the city's museums, the collection, and the kind of heritage that exists within amazing neighbourhoods that populate Birmingham. And we're really trying to encourage communities in our physical presences to kind of really take the spaces of the museums and start to work them on their own terms. But the Guiders projects enabled us to kind of look at how we convert our co-production into a new digital framework that supports our work with communities and neighbourhoods. But really this project looks deeper about how can we produce more personal and unique narratives of heritage and identity around these areas that are both inspired by daily lives, Aston as an area, but also memories of Aston Hall as a museum as well. And also the collections that people stumble across and engage with whilst they're there. So the big shift of being able to move digitally does navigate many different instances of the pandemic, the challenges that we've had there, but also the digital nature reflected the approach to the project. So what we're trying to do within the project is work with dedicated community producers who are paid within the roles, which I'll come back to, but we're really kind of working together with the community producers and museum specialists, AV producers and storytellers to really feed in and build the skills of the producers along the project. And what we're trying to do is, because it is a co-production narrative, we're really trying to engage with what will the outcome look like within that. But we know it's a digital format, so the varies between podcasts, video and live stream are really going to be the emphasis of the project. How does that work for you? How do you feel most comfortable with delivering that? And what kind of capacity will the output look like? So it's really trying to broaden the scope of the way we deliver co-production online, but also the way we kind of open the floor to a more democratic understanding of what the output will look like. But also to kind of promote the museum engagement is also a place to reflect on collections, but it's also a place for well-being, learning and safety, and we really want to enable that to take place. So as we get specialists to work with our co-producers, it really kind of pushes things forward for us as we find out new digital engagement as well. So we also want to kind of work with the projects in relation to the live lives today. So when we talk about our understanding of Black Lives Matter, our kind of understanding of the pandemic and the impact this has all had on us, we want to understand that this is a difficult and challenging time to kind of take new things on board, and to dedicate time to a project like this means quite a lot. So we have decided throughout our co-production work that the values of payment are integral to what we do. And we really want to kind of make sure that every community producer has the opportunity to have the social mobility to go and explore culture on their own terms, whether that's the payment that kind of releases people for the day, or whether it gets them outwardly mobile to explore and spend time within communities and chat to people. So it kind of reassures the kind of the ability to move around the city, to move around communities and talk with people in those neighbourhoods as well as ourselves as well. So really kind of trying to commit to the cycle of co-production. As you'd expect, the project does have a dedicated board within the museum and a project working group, but that's where the community producers also play a part in understanding the governance around that. And all our equality around payment is about trying to democratise the process of creativity within museums projects. And it's been really interesting to see how that's has motivated our engagement with our neighbourhoods and our producers to have a new confidence to be able to reach out, to have more clarity on the things that we can do within a project, and the confidence to not just sit there as participants, but actually to be embedded in the fabric of making the project structure and how it works and how that reflective practice comes in. We wanted the project to really kind of look at some of those historical, deeper injustices that have been going on around racism and lack of representation too, which are being formed. This project's halfway through, it's deep in process with storytellers and kind of reflective on those areas of Aston, which is an incredibly super diverse neighbourhood of Birmingham. But as we move forward, we think about different levels of pay and the complexities around pay as well, whether that impacts the threshold of payments around benefits, whether it actually does enable people to move around freely, to come to the museum, to come online, to get access to Zoom licenses and everything like that. So how can we kind of remove the barriers away from engaging with us on a digital platform and really and truly give a benefit into engagement with us? It's about the payment aspect of what we're doing is really trying to remove those perceptions of hierarchy and benefit the long-term relationships with our communities, especially at Aston, but actually broader Birmingham communities too. To not see us as an organisation that's coming for volunteers to tell a new story and to try something differently. And this is about establishing the fact that people can really have that confidence in moving around and engaging with us. But also, it also creates a different level of how we work with volunteers within our organisation. So how we work with the community producers to identify volunteers in their own neighbourhoods and areas. But again, we can reimburse through their volunteering, but they're volunteering for producers as well as the museum as well. So there's a greater level of ownership. It really, the project overall has really been defined by our co-production, our collaborative projects. In 2017, we started our Faith in Birmingham galleries, which were our first look at what does live faith look like in Birmingham as a mass co-production project with many different voices and much goodwill. But again, it was trying to get the benefit of people's time and their allocation. How do we commit that in a deeper and more meaningful way? We understand that goodwill and collaboration are great and they're a really positive aspect. But also, when museum workers are working with, researching, producing and creating in a museum, there does start to become a bit of a void between the communities we work with and the day-to-day life of the museum as well, which can create some external perceptions of the institutional hierarchy of an organisation as well. So we really want to embed our payment to look at that, to understand that when people come in, they are going to be rewarded and paid equally, whether that's the day rate in parallel to a member of staff, or it's thinking about the basis of our living wages. So we really want to try and demystify that and move it away. As we look at a process, a fair pay going forward. The work through the projects such as Guide Us and our work has really kind of put community payment at the very front of our budget setting. The understanding of how many people we can work with, how many people we can engage in, what resources really sit alongside real people on a day-to-day basis, knowing that we have the resources to work museum projects around. We want to produce this as a really kind of, it's our steps towards being more the anti-elites, not just engaging with the communities that are really thoroughly embedded within heritage projects all the time, and start to break that and open it up to the people that don't necessarily get those opportunities to engage in a deeper level. And through this way, we can start to break some barriers really down with our audiences, and also see how it has a knock-on effect to our other projects across the museums too. So through projects such as Guide Us and our co-production, we've extended the fair payment and bursary schemes across our youth climate forums, across our curator programs for young people, including Don't Settle, where we talk about reinventing museum stories too. So it really is rippling across the museum. It's a very complex narrative against individual projects, but it's having the confidence to put that payment in at the very start. It does change our perceptions of budgeting and allocation, but it also makes us understand the real processes of time, getting people familiar, developing, sharing and learning before we get to project activity too. And that's just as important the level of payment within our projects as the recording, the manifesting, the shiny finished end product, and the kind of the labelling as such. So really, it is a case basis. There are many different aspects to look at, and our biggest learning is to also really ensure that people get the best opportunity, and the payment also doesn't become a barrier to participation from our sides. I mentioned earlier about payment and social welfare and universal credits. We've really got to be mindful of how that works with the audiences we work with moving forward. So we are able to be flexible. We have great opportunities that we can pay people relatively easy through ourselves as a museum trust, so I understand the complexities of different organisations, but it's really sticking to that and making sure that they're at the front of our understanding with our communities and neighbourhoods, so they feel really empowered and start to remove the hierarchy of our work away. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It does rather leave us a little short on question time, I'm afraid, but it was so interesting to hear from everybody today about their projects, and I didn't want to interrupt any of the great hints and tips we were hearing about. So really, I'll just leave it here today to thank our speakers today, and to thank the technical team behind all of this who've made it possible for Andrew to still be able to join us and tell us about the great work at Birmingham. So yeah, please show your appreciation for our speakers today.